She left the car running for 3 minutes before she turned it off. That was the part she would not be able to explain later. Not to Diane, not to anyone, the way she sat in the parking lot of the Cascade Trailhead, with the engine idling and the heater blowing warm air against her hands, and simply could not make herself move. The lot was empty except for a green Forest Service truck parked crooked near the wooden sign, and the sign said, Crater Ridge Trail 4.2 miles. And someone had carved a small heart into the post below it with a pocket knife. And Ruth stared at that heart for a long time. She did not know why. She was not someone who lingered over small things. She had spent 30 years in emergency nursing, which meant she had spent 30 years not lingering over anything. She turned the engine off. The silence that followed was the particular silence of October mornings in Oregon, dense and damp, full of the smell of pine resin and wet earth. The kind of silence that pressed against the ears like something physical. Ruth sat with it. The dashboard clock read 6:48. She had driven from the motel in Gifford without eating, without coffee, and she was not hungry, which had been true for most of the past 8 months. Food had become a transaction rather than a pleasure. She ate because her body required it the same way she slept, because her body required it the same way she had gotten out of bed every morning since February the 14th, because her body required that too. She reached across to the passenger seat. Her phone was there, a charger cable still plugged in the screen, lit with a notification from Diane sent at 11 the previous night. Mom, please call me back. It doesn't have to be long. Just let me hear your voice. Ruth read the message twice, then unplugged the cable, placed the phone carefully on the seat, and got out of the car. She did not bring it with her. She told herself this was not a decision. She told herself she simply forgot it the way she forgot things more often now, where she had put her keys, whether she had eaten, what day of the week it was. This was the story she chose. It was easier than the alternative, which was that somewhere between Portland and the motel and this empty parking lot, she had begun to understand that she was exhausted in a way that sleep could not touch, and that the sound of another human voice, even Diane's voice, especially Diane's voice, required something from her that she no longer had available to give. She slung the small pack over her shoulder, canvas dark green worn at the strap seams, and started up the trail. The pack contained what it always contained when Ruth went anywhere alone: the medical kit. This was not preparedness so much as habit. The same way she still woke at 6 regardless of what shift she was on. The same way she still reached for latex gloves before touching anything wet. 30 years of emergency nursing rewired certain things in the body below the level of conscious thought. The kit was a small red nylon pouch, soft-sided the size of a thick paperback. Inside 4 4x4 gauze pads, a roll of medical tape, nitrile gloves in a fold-top bag, 2 packets of antibiotic ointment ibuprofen in a small labeled vial, and a coil of 2-0 nylon suture thread on a curved needle sealed in sterile packaging. She had replaced the suture kit last month out of habit, even though she had not sutured anything outside a hospital in years. It was still there, because removing it had never occurred to her. There was also a single-serve pack of trail mix she had taken from the motel's complimentary breakfast without meaning to, and at the bottom of the front pocket under the first aid kit folded into a square, no larger than a playing card. A photograph. She did not look at the photograph. She knew it was there the way she knew her own pulse was there. A background fact constant not requiring verification. The trail was quiet, and the light was early and thin, coming sideways through the firs in long flat columns that turned the mist gold near the ground. Ruth walked without paying attention to the trail markers. This was careless, and she knew it was careless. And she did it anyway because paying attention felt like a demand she wasn't prepared to meet. She watched her boots instead. Left foot, right foot. The ground was soft with fallen needles, and the going was easy for the first hour, a gentle grade that wound through old-growth Douglas fir so tall their crowns disappeared into the overcast. She was thinking about Daniel's hands. This was not unusual. She thought about his hands often in the way grief attaches itself to specific things rather than the whole, not the whole man, but the particular detail that becomes the container for everything else. For Ruth, it was his hands. Wide across the knuckles, rough on the palm from the years he'd spent doing carpentry on weekends before his back made that impossible. The skin on the back of his left hand had a pale scar along the thumb joint from a table saw in 1991, and she had been the one to close that wound 8 stitches in their kitchen over his protest that it wasn't serious. It had been serious. She had been right, as she was right about most medical things, and he had teased her about it for years afterward. You just wanted an excuse to practice on me. She had said I didn't need an excuse. I had a willing patient. He had said I wouldn't call me willing. And she had said I wouldn't call you willing either. But you sat still, which is all I actually needed. She had thought of that conversation at the funeral and had not cried, which people had noticed. She had seen them noticing. She had been too tired to explain that she had already cried in the hospital room twice, once the night they moved him to palliative care, and once the morning he stopped knowing her name. By the time there were flowers and a dark wood casket and a minister reading from 1 Corinthians, she had been so far past crying that she was in a different country entirely, a flat and colorless country, where other people's words arrived muffled as through water. Diane had cried. Diane had cried well and openly the way Ruth had not been able to, and people had found this appropriate. Ruth had found it appropriate too. She was not resentful. She was glad one of them had cried properly. It just hadn't been her. Her husband, Daniel Calloway, had died on February 14th at 4:22 in the morning, and Ruth had been holding his right hand when it happened. The scarred hand, and she had stayed there until a nurse she had worked with for 11 years came in at shift change and gently said her name. They had been married 34 years and had lived in the same house in Portland for 31 of those years, and had raised Diane in that house and grown old in it in the way you grow old somewhere when you are paying attention to other things, which is to say gradually, and then all at once. 3 weeks after the funeral, Diane had driven back to Denver. Ruth understood. Diane had her own life, a husband, a teaching job. Ruth had told her to go. 4 months after that, Ruth had sold the house because she could not sleep in it and could not sleep in it and could not find a third option. She was living in a motel in Gifford now, which was not a plan, just a location. The way a stone at the bottom of a slope is not where it intended to be. By the second hour, the trail had steepened, and the overcast had thickened, and the light had flattened to a uniform gray. The firs gave way to hemlock, and the undergrowth pressed closer to the trail edges wet from the previous night's rain. She passed what she estimated was the 2-mile marker, and then 20 minutes later came to a fork where no fork should have been according to the trailhead sign, and stopped. She stood at the fork and assessed both options the way she had once assessed competing diagnoses, left tracked north and upward into thicker trees, right descended toward what looked like a drainage. She considered for a moment with the particular focus she brought to clinical problems, not panic, just assessment, and then acknowledged that she had been watching her feet instead of the trail signs for the better part of an hour, and that she did not actually know where she was. She performed an inventory. Breathing normal, heart rate elevated, but stable, no pain. Adequate hydration pack present. Phone not present. She had chosen to leave it, and she knew that now, standing at an unmarked fork in a trail she could no longer locate on any mental map. And there was a strange quality to the knowledge, not quite fear and not quite relief. Something between them that she did not have a clean word for. She took the right fork because the ground was softer, and she thought she could track her own prints back if necessary. An hour later, she was standing on a slope she had never intended to reach, looking down at a creek she did not recognize, and the light through the trees was coming from the wrong angle, too low, too warm. And she understood that several hours had passed without her accounting for them properly. The air had changed. colder damper carrying the quality that comes in the hour before the light fails. She had treated patients with hypothermia. She knew what that quality meant in October in the Cascades. She was constructing a mental list of resources the medical kit the trail mix, approximately half a liter of water, when the light moved. Not the ambient light. A specific light separate from the grey overcast caught in something reflective. West of her position below on the slope coming through a gap in the canopy where the trees thinned. Not daylight bouncing off a clearing. Something reflecting off glass fixed and still. Ruth assessed it clinically steady, not flickering, which eliminated fire at distance. Appearing at a fixed point between two specific trees, which eliminated water in motion. Approximately 6 feet from the ground, which was the right height for a window in a small structure. She adjusted her direction and began moving toward it. The slope leveled as she descended, and the trees thinned into a natural clearing, perhaps 40 feet across, where the ground cover changed from fern to shorter grass, dead and pale now in October. At the far edge of the clearing, facing east, a cabin. She stopped when she saw it. Not because she was startled, because the visual scene required processing before she could act on it. The cabin was small, one room, she guessed maybe two, built from timber that had gone silver gray with weathering. The roof pitched low at the rear. There were no missing boards on the face. She could see no collapsed sections. The door sat straight in its frame. The window to the left of the door held the light she had tracked from the slope, intact glass not obscured with moss and grime. No smoke from the chimney. No sound from inside or around the structure. No tracks she could see from the clearing's edge. And beside the front door, placed with a deliberateness that nothing else about the scene could explain, a pair of men's work boots. Dark brown leather lace-up worn at the toe. Standing upright as though set there by someone who had just stepped inside without them and fully intended to step back out. Ruth did not move for a long moment. The boots were the detail that held her. Not the cabin itself. Not the intact glass, not the straight-hung door. She could attribute all of those to durable construction and good timber. But boots placed that deliberately did not sit beside a door for years without someone removing them. Boots placed that deliberately were a recent act, a communication. Someone was saying, "I will be back for these." She crossed the clearing slowly. The grass was stiff under her boots and her breath came in visible plumes, and the light was leaving fast sliding behind the ridge to the west. She was aware of the calculation running at the back of her mind. Temperature, exposure, available daylight, no phone, no shelter. And that whatever her reservations about this cabin might be, the alternative was spending an October night on an Oregon slope with half a liter of water and a packet of trail mix. She stopped 3 feet from the door. Her right hand came up before she had finished deliberating, and her fingers hovered for a moment an inch from the wood. The door was pine, the grain had that close texture, and it had been treated at some point, the oil worn unevenly now, the surface rough and dry under her fingertips. When she finally made contact, the texture stopped her. Not the roughness itself, but what it redirected her toward, the grain of wood beneath her hand, and the grain of different wood beneath a different hand, in a different room, at a different hour. Daniel's hands in the last weeks had felt like this. Not the hands she had known for 34 years, but the hands of those final weeks, dry and loose at the skin. She had held them for hours at the bedside and traced the scar on his left thumb and said nothing. Because there was nothing adequate to say, and sometimes nothing is the truest thing available. She stood with her hand on the door and breathed. She was not going to cry, not here, not at a stranger's door in failing light. She pushed. The door opened inward without resistance, no catch, no groan from the hinges swinging smoothly on hardware that was heavier and better fitted than the cabin's age suggested. Someone had maintained these hinges. Maintained hinges on an aging door meant regular presence. Regular presence meant the owner was not decades gone. She stepped inside. The room was dim, the window's light nearly spent, but there was enough to see a single space, perhaps 12 by 14 feet. A table against the left wall, plain plank construction, one chair pushed in against it. A narrow sleeping platform built into the right wall, wood slats, no mattress. a folded wool blanket at one end, an iron stove in the far corner, small the pipe exiting through the wall. A shelf above the sleeping platform held several rusted tins and a glass jar with a metal lid. Near the door, two pegs driven into the wall, one bare one holding a folded length of canvas. The air was still, not cold the way the outside was cold, the particular middle temperature of a space closed for days rather than months, retaining some residue of the last fire. It did not smell abandoned. Abandoned buildings smelled of wet wood and mouse and slow decay. This smelled of smoke and pine, and underneath both something faint old coffee or something burned in a cup not ancient. Ruth moved to the table. In the last of the window light, a cup, ceramic white with a blue rim. She stopped. Even in the near dark, she could see that the cup had no dust on it. In a cabin this old, in a forest this damp, that was not accidental. That cup had been in this room in recent weeks. She turned toward the stove and opened the firebox door, ash gray cold. But the texture was wrong for old ash. Old ash consolidates into a pale crust over months. This ash was still loose, still an individual moving faintly with the air current from the open door. She touched a small amount with her index finger. It broke apart immediately. Not this morning, not yesterday. Somewhere in the past 10 days. She looked at the firewood stacked against the wall, split clean, placed with the cut faces outward 3 layers deep. Not thrown there, not accumulated. Placed. And in the ash dust on the floorboards near the stack boot prints, large, the same size as the boots standing outside the door. She straightened up. She was standing in the middle of a room that was not abandoned, whose owner had been present within the past 2 weeks, who had not taken their boots when they left, and who might return at any point. She was also standing in the only available shelter within walking distance on an October evening in the Cascades, with no phone and no food beyond half a packet of trail mix. She catalogued these facts without allowing either to cancel the other. She moved to the table and reached past the cup to set her pack down, and her knuckle caught the cup's base and lifted it slightly, and she saw it, a piece of paper folded once tucked beneath the cup's foot. Not hidden placed there, the way a note might be left beneath a glass at a diner, to be found when someone cleared the table. She set the cup aside and unfolded it. The handwriting was clear and older, the penmanship of a generation that had learned cursive in school and kept it. The ink had faded to brownish gray. She had to angle the paper toward the dying window light to read it. If you need this place more than I do, it's yours. No signature, no date. Nothing else. She read it once quickly, and then again slowly, the way she read unusual lab results confirming the words were in the right order, confirming she wasn't supplying meaning that wasn't there. The sentence was complete. It was not a fragment of something longer. There was no qualifying clause, no instruction, no condition. Just that and then the edge of the paper. She folded it back on its crease and placed it on the table. The light was nearly gone. She could not stand here indefinitely weighing the meaning of a sentence. She had firewood and a lighter in the medical kit she carried. One because disposable lighters had uses in wound care. And she had approximately 100 tasks that needed to happen before the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and the part of her that had spent 30 years triaging emergencies was already sequencing, already moving. Overriding the part that felt she should ask someone's permission first. She put the lighter to dry bark wedged in the woodpile. First attempt, no catch. Second, a flicker that went out when she exhaled too hard. Third attempt. She cupped her hands the way Daniel had shown her on a camping trip in the Coast Range nearly 4 decades ago. You're giving it wind before it's ready. Ruthie, give it a second to want to burn, and the bark caught and held. And she fed it small sticks from the woodpile's edge until the fire had enough purchase to take the larger pieces. She sat back on her heels in front of the open stove door and watched the fire establish itself. She did not think about anything at all for approximately 2 minutes, which was the first time that had been possible in 8 months. Then she brought the stove door most of the way closed to control the draw, and turned to face the room in the fire's growing light. The cup was on the table. The note was beside it. The boots were outside. Someone had written, "If you need this place more than I do," and then left and taken their reasons with them. And Ruth was standing on their floor with a fire she had just built in their stove. What she felt beneath the procedural calm, beneath the inventory of tasks, was something she had no clinical category for. Not gratitude and not relief. Something closer to recognition, the feeling of stepping into a room arranged for the same dimensions as you, even though it had been arranged for someone else entirely. She moved through the tasks that remained. She set the medical kit on the shelf where she could see it. She took out the photograph and did not look at it and placed it face down beside the kit. She ate half the trail mix in slow increments and drank a quarter of her water. She tested the sleeping platform. It held her weight without flex and pulled the wool blanket to the end where she could reach it. Then she closed the cabin door and stood with her back against it in the growing warmth from the stove. Outside, the forest had gone fully dark. The clearing would be invisible now, the trees just shapes against shapes. Somewhere in that dark, the boots stood beside the door, catching whatever the night brought down on them. Ruth listened to the fire and the building warmth and her own breathing, which had at some point in the last hour slowed to something that was no longer mechanical. Then she heard it. From the tree line, a sound, not wind, not a settling branch, not any of the small animal sounds she had catalogued in her peripheral awareness all day. Something heavier. Footsteps on soft ground, deliberate, and then stopped. Complete silence. Whatever it was had paused at the edge of the clearing and was still. Ruth did not move away from the door. She stood against it and put her full attention on the silence and waited for the silence to tell her something. It told her nothing more. After 5 minutes, the quality of the dark outside changed in the subtle way it changes when something that was present is present no longer. And she understood that whatever had stood at the tree line had withdrawn. She stood against the door for another few minutes, not from fear, but from the discipline of completion, not walking away from a thing until you are certain the thing is finished. Then she crossed to the sleeping platform, pulled off her boots, wrapped herself in the wool blanket, and lay looking at the ceiling boards while the fire built the room around her into something that felt cautiously and provisionally like a place a person might stay. It was the first clear decision she had made since February. She woke before light reached the clearing, as she had woken before light for 30 years of early shifts, not gradually but completely, awareness arriving all at once. The sleeping platform was bare wood, and she had used her jacket as padding, and the wool blanket smelled of cedar and cold storage, and she lay still for a moment, taking stock. Ruth Calloway, 63 years old, a cabin in the Cascade Range in Oregon. October Day 2. The answers came cleanly. She got up. The fire had reduced to coals, not dead, a faint red pulse still visible through the grate, and she coaxed it back with small pieces and patient breath. No lighter this time, just the coals in the air and the specific patience she had once applied to difficult veins. The fire recovered. She filled the metal pot she had found on the shelf and set it to heat on the stove surface, then put on her jacket and went outside. The clearing in early morning was a different thing than the clearing at dusk. The grass was rimed with frost, every blade separate and distinct, pale and stiff in the gray pre-dawn. Her breath came in slow, visible plumes. The boots were still beside the door. She checked this first, without consciously deciding to, and the checking told her something about what she had actually been listening for through the night, which was not the unknown person, but the absence of them. The boots were there. The frost on their toe caps was undisturbed. She walked the clearing's perimeter, looking at the tree line, the ground at the forest's edge, the slope to the east, where the light was beginning to find the upper fir branches. No new tracks. Whatever had stood at the tree line the night before had not returned closer. The creek was down the eastern slope, 5 minutes at a careful pace. The water was cold enough to ache in her wrist as she filled the pot and bottle both. She crouched beside it longer than was necessary, because the sound of its steady clean, entirely indifferent to her presence, was the first sound in months that asked nothing of her in return. Back at the cabin, she made a proper inventory in the morning light. The shelf, held 4 rusted tins, 2 empty, one with hardened salt she could still use, one with 3 wooden matches and an intact striking surface. She set these on the table as assets. Behind the woodpile in the corner near the stove, she found a length of wire coiled around itself, galvanized thin, approximately 18 inches stiff, but workable. She set that beside the matches. She opened the medical kit and laid the contents in a row on the table, the way she had laid instruments out before procedures. 4 gauze pads, 1 roll of medical tape, 4 pairs of nitrile gloves, 2 packets of antibiotic ointment, 12 ibuprofen tablets, the lighter, and the suture kit, 2-0 nylon thread on a curved needle, approximately 3 feet, coiled strong enough for a closing stitch on a significant wound, which meant strong enough for other things if she thought carefully about what those things required. She drank the heated water without flavoring and ate the second half of the trail mix across 20 minutes. Then she went out to find food. She kept to the clearing's edge, not entering the trees deeply. This was resource management, the same principle that had kept her walking, not running in hospital corridors for 30 years. Speed that cost you footing cost more than it saved. She moved along the tree line, looking at the low growth where light reached the ground. Salal Oregon grape late season huckleberry. The huckleberry had been worked over by birds, but she found clusters on the north-facing lower branches that had been missed. She took them carefully, rolling each berry between her fingers before eating. Not enough, a caloric gesture. She kept moving. Near the northern edge of the clearing, where a large Douglas fir had fallen and was halfway through its decades-long return to soil, she stopped. The ground around the log was disturbed in a specific way. Small hollows in the soft earth evenly spaced the compression of something moving on 4 small feet in a regular pattern. The tracks led under the near end of the log. She crouched and looked at the entrance to the hollow beneath the root mass. Fresh droppings. A tuft of brown fur caught on a bark edge, occupied or very recently so by something rabbit-sized. She stood and looked at the suture thread in her jacket pocket, which she had brought without deciding to bring it, 3 feet of 2-0 nylon. She thought about what she half remembered from a wilderness medicine seminar the hospital had sent her to in the 90s. And from something Daniel had described once about his grandfather's farm in Minnesota. A snare required a fixed anchor, a loop with a slip mechanism, and correct placement relative to the animal's travel line. The wire could serve as the anchor. The suture thread could form the loop. She had tied 10,000 surgical knots. She had tied them in body cavities with limited visibility, with instruments rather than fingers under time pressure, with lives in actual immediate balance. She knew how to make a loop that tightened under load and did not release. She crouched beside the log with the wire and the thread and worked slowly without second guessing. When she finished, she had something not elegant but functional. An anchor loop around a root. A slip noose positioned 3 inches from the ground at the hollow's entrance, sized for a small animal's head and shoulders. She stood and looked at it. She had placed a bet she could not immediately verify. She walked back to the cabin with the feeling of someone who has done what they can and is now required to wait, which was a feeling she knew well from medicine and had never entirely made peace with. The morning passed in necessary work. She brought 2 more loads of water from the creek, filling the glass jar she had found on the shelf. She split 2 of the larger log sections with the camp hatchet she located on the back wall. She had missed it in the darkness of her first night and added the splits to the stack. She examined the door latch and found that the interior bolt had worn enough that it no longer engaged fully, and she spent 40 minutes fashioning a brace from a scrap of wood near the cabin's exterior wall, wedging it at an angle between the door and the floor in a way that would require significant force to overcome from outside. Not a permanent solution, sufficient. In the early afternoon, she went back to check the snare. The loop was undisturbed. No impressions in the soft earth around the hollow entrance, no new sign. She adjusted the noose height by ½ an inch, rewrapped the anchor wire more tightly, smoothed the disturbed ground with her palm. Patience was not her difficulty. She had waited beside hospital beds for hours in active stillness. The kind that is not passive, but rather a sustained form of presence, the body quiet and the attention fully awake. She walked back to the cabin. She was coming up the slope from the creek that afternoon carrying the pot when she saw the boot prints. She almost missed them. The ground at the clearing's northern edge was firm, and the impressions were partial. The front half of a large shoe pressed into a narrow band of moisture near a root depression. 2 prints, then nothing as the ground hardened. She set the pot down and crouched. The tread was distinct, the rubber compound still defined rather than worn, size 11 or 12. Not her own, which were a size 8. The prints were oriented toward the cabin. She looked up at the tree line to the north. Nothing moved. The trees were still, and the clearing was empty. She calculated the prints pointed toward the structure, and then the record ended. Whoever made them had either continued on harder ground or stood here and turned around. She picked up the pot and went inside and set the brace against the door, and did not sleep so much as wait through the dark lying on the platform, with the wool blanket pulled up. Her attention distributed between the fire and the door, and the faint sound of the creek below the slope. Until at some point past midnight, the monitoring became sleep, and stayed that way until just before dawn. Day 3 began with the snare. She checked it before, fire before water, walking to the log in the early gray with her jacket unzipped, because she had been moving fast and was warm from it. The loop had been displaced, not the anchor which was still tight around the root, but the noose itself had turned inward. The soft earth around the hollow entrance showed new impressions, 4-footed, close-spaced, unmistakable. Something had approached and the loop had failed the angle wrong. The height slightly off the animal's head passing over, or the loop catching at the withers without completing the tightening. She could see exactly where the logic had broken down. She reset it lower, tilted the approach angle, smoothed the earth around the entrance with her palm, and went back for water and fire. And what passed for breakfast wood sorrel she had found near the creek tart and small-leafed better than nothing. She thought about Diane while she waited. Not the recent Diane, the one who had left 17 voicemails, whose voice carried the frequency of a child trying not to sound frightened. She was thinking about the Diane who had come home from her first year of college and stood in the Portland kitchen watching Ruth close a wound on Daniel's forearm from a workshop accident, and had said, "Mom, you take care of everyone except yourself." Ruth had said something dismissive. "I'm fine, hand me the tape," and Diane had not pushed, because Diane had learned early that pushing with Ruth produced friction and not movement. The words had stayed lodged somewhere unexamined because at the time, Ruth had believed Diane was wrong and had found no reason to revise that until approximately now, sitting against a dead log in the Cascades, waiting for a rabbit with her medical kit in her jacket pocket and a glass jar of creek water back at a stranger's cabin, and nothing waiting for her anywhere that she was obligated to return to. Diane had not been wrong. That was the thing she was arriving at. Diane had been right in the way that people who love you are sometimes right about the thing you will need the longest time to hear: movement at the hollow entrance. Ruth went completely still. She was 8 feet from the snare behind the log, breathing in the shallow automatic rhythm she used in rooms with unstable patients. The rabbit emerged slowly. Small brown ears flat, moving with the unhurried confidence of an animal that believed its perimeter was clear. 3 steps, 4. Its head dropped and the loop caught at its shoulders, and the logic of the slipknot completed itself, swift and unambiguous. The nylon doing exactly what 2-0 nylon was designed to do under load. Ruth came around the log in 4 steps and finished it cleanly. She had done harder things with her hands under worse conditions with higher consequences. She stood beside the log and did not try to make the moment into something it wasn't. Food. She had needed food, had made a plan, and the plan had worked. She carried it back without ceremony. She worked near the stove with the hatchet and the surgical scissors and wasted nothing. The fire handled the rest. The smell that filled the room afterward was protein and wood smoke, and something underneath it that was not unpleasant, a space being used for its actual purpose. She ate slowly and methodically, saved a quarter portion on the shelf, and then took the bones outside and dropped them far from the cabin. She reset the snare at the log before she came back. She was outside near the snare when she heard footsteps in the trees to the north. Not ambiguous this time, not the single interrupted sound from the first night, but deliberate and rhythmic, someone walking with both weight and direction. She turned and did not run, because running told you nothing useful and cost you position. She stood with her hands loose at her sides and watched the tree line. He came out without hurrying, 70 perhaps, or just past it. Tall, the kind of tall that had settled with age into something that was simply a fact about the space he occupied, rather than an imposition on it. His hair was white and cut close. His face was deeply weathered, in the way of men who had spent decades outside, not as a hobby, but as the nature of their work. He wore a dark green flannel shirt and canvas pants and trail boots, different from the pair by the cabin door, newer, trail specific. He carried a canvas bag over one shoulder. He stopped when he saw her, and they looked at each other across 20 feet of frosted grass. He was not surprised. That was the first thing she registered. He had stopped walking, but the stopping had the quality of adjustment rather than shock. The recalibration of a careful person encountering a chart that said something slightly different than expected. He had seen her smoke. He had come to verify rather than confront. She understood this before he spoke. "You staying?" His voice was unhurried. The voice of a man for whom questions in difficult terrain were tools rather than performances. Ruth felt the weight of everything contained in the question and chose to answer only its surface. "I don't know yet." He nodded the way someone nods when an answer confirms something they already suspected. He looked at her snare, at the surgical scissors still in her left hand, at the cabin behind her. He set the canvas bag down at the edge of the clearing. She could see the shapes through the fabric. Something flat and rectangular. Something cylindrical, a folded bulk that was probably the top. He had been planning to leave these before he knew she was here. He had been coming regardless. He was already turning to go when she spoke. "Whose cabin is this?" He stopped without turning fully. "Used to be mine. Before that, someone else's. That's how it works out here." He resumed walking, and the trees received him without comment. She stood at the clearing's edge with the surgical scissors in her hand, and the canvas bag at her feet, and the fire still burning in the stove behind her, and understood something she had not had the full picture for. Until now, this was not a man who had abandoned a place. This was a man who maintained one. The note under the cup, the split firewood, the cleaned hinges, the dry matches in the rusted tin, these were not the remnants of someone gone, but the ongoing acts of someone who understood that a cabin with an intact roof and a dry woodpile was more useful to the world occupied than empty. She carried the bag inside. Mulled salt wrapped in wax paper, a full box of wooden matches, the top folded into a tight rectangle. She stood looking at them on the shelf for a moment, and then went back out and reset the snare, and brought in firewood and filled the water jar, and did not examine too closely what it meant, that the sight of supplies left without demand had produced in her chest the closest thing to ease she had felt in 8 months. That afternoon, she stretched the tarp over the section of sleeping platform nearest the wall, where the ceiling board showed the most wear, reinforced the door brace with a second piece of scrap wood at the base, and found that the glass jar fit neatly in the corner of the stove's warming shelf and kept the water from going cold between uses. Small adjustments, each one compounding the last. By late afternoon, the cabin looked like a place someone was living in rather than sheltering in, and the distinction mattered, though she could not have said when exactly the line between them had shifted. She ate the saved portion from the morning before the light went, and afterwards sat on the sleeping platform with the blanket across her knees, and the fire small and steady, and the room warm enough that she had taken off her jacket. The photograph was still face down on the shelf. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the door brace and the water level in the jar, present noted, not yet requiring action. Outside wind had come up after days of stillness, moving through the fir crowns in long, slow waves. It was the first wind she had heard since arriving, and it changed the character of the cabin, made it creak faintly at the roof joints, made the stovepipe tick with thermal variation, animated the space in a way the preceding silence had not. She sat and listened. Something in that sound reached beneath the procedural calm she had been operating under, beneath the task sequencing and the useful busyness of staying alive. She could not name what it reached, but she stopped moving and let the wind do what it was doing without trying to organize it into anything useful. And for the length of one long breath, she was not a nurse or a widow or a mother or someone who had left her phone on a car seat and walked into the trees. She was a person in a warm room listening to wind, which was perhaps the smallest possible unit of being alive, and which was enough. She laid down and slept before the fire went to coals, and this time did not surface until morning. Day 5 brought rain that had arrived quietly in the night, and had made its arrangements and intended to keep them, not the driving rain that announced itself, but a steady, deliberate rain with no interest in being noticed. Ruth lay on the platform in the early grey and listened to it work on the roof, and found the new drip a thin thread of water hitting the top of the iron stove near the pipe joint, and hissing immediately to steam. Not a crisis, a variable. She fixed the pipe joint with a strip of medical tape wrapped tight around the fitting, the tape stiffening in the rising heat within minutes. She reinforced the tarp over the sleeping platform's corner, where the original leak had been. Then she went out in the rain with the clay-wet hatchet handle and found the exterior failure point, a split in one of the ridge boards, checked open a finger's width and packed it with a mixture of wet clay from the creek bank and fibrous hemlock inner bark, which held the clay in position while it set. She worked standing on the cabin's lower roof overhang in the rain without complaint, because this was simply what the morning required. By midday, the ceiling had stopped dripping. Ruth stood outside in the thinning rain and looked at the patched ridge with the critical eye of someone who knew exactly how close to the margin their solution was operating. Close. But the margin was hers. The rain had eased to mist when she heard him at the tree line again. His footsteps, already familiar, the weight and spacing of them, a known quantity in the way that close proximity makes sounds known in the body before the mind has named them. He came across the clearing in the late afternoon grey, wearing a rain shell over the flannel, his boots wet to the ankle from the lower creek crossing. He looked at the patched ridge without pausing, took in the detail of the repacked clay and the adjusted tarp visible through the window, and set his bag down near the door with the same deliberate economy as before. She surprised herself. "Come in." 2 words she had not planned. The cabin was warm from the fire, and the rain on the window softened the light, and they sat on opposite sides of the table with hot water. She gave him the cup she drank from the glass jar, and neither of them rushed anything. He told her about the cabin without preamble, the way people who have lived alone for some time often speak directly without the social scaffolding of warm-up. He had been coming here for 12 years. His wife Eleanor had died in 2011 in their home in Bend. For the first year, he had done what people told him to do, stayed connected, accepted help, did not make large decisions. All of that had been correct and also insufficient. In the second year, he had started coming to the cabin, not because it solved anything, because here the only measure of a day was whether he was still warm and fed at the end of it. And that was a standard he could meet. Took me 2 full winters before I stopped treating this place like somewhere I was just passing through. His voice carrying the specific weight of a sentence that had been true for a long time before being spoken aloud. Ruth looked at the cup between his hands. She had cleaned it every morning she had been here, wiped it with a corner of gauze, set it back in its position, and now she understood that its condition when she found it had not been luck. He had cleaned it before leaving. He had left it ready. You kept the cup clean, not a question. He looked at the cup, in case someone needed to use it. She had spent 30 years watching people say one thing and mean something larger. And she knew he was not talking about the cup. He was talking about all of it: the note, the boots, the woodpile, the dry matches in the tin, the maintained hinges. He had kept all of it ready, not for a specific person, but for the category of person who arrived needing it. And she had arrived and fit the category. And that was all the justification the situation required. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the photograph and set it on the table between them face up. It was a 4x6 print, slightly soft at one corner from handling. Danielle on a hillside in August, Light holding a piece of firewood, grinning at the camera, at her behind the camera, with the expression of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. It was this unremarkable completeness, this ordinary and total contentment, that she had been unable to look at directly for 8 months. She looked at it now. Marcus looked at the photograph. He looked at Ruth. He looked back at the photograph. His hand stayed around the cup, and he said nothing about Daniel or Eleanor or loss or time. There was no offering of perspective, no consolation, no well-meaning framework. He simply looked and was present, which was the most correct response another human being could have given her. And she felt it settle in her chest, like something that had been traveling for a long time and had finally arrived. The fire ticked in the stove. The rain moved through the clearing outside. Ruth put the photograph back in her pocket, face up this time, rather than face down, and drank from the glass jar. Marcus stood after a while. At the door, he turned back, and in the pause before he spoke, she could see him selecting something carefully from the larger set of things that could have been said. Eleanor would have fixed that roof better. He went out. She sat with it. Then she smiled, the first time since February, and the most surprising event of the week, which was saying something given the week. He was almost to the tree line when he stopped and reached into his coat pocket and held something out without turning fully around. A phone, her phone. She crossed the clearing and took it from his outstretched hand. Found this on the South Trail, his voice even without explanation. Day before yesterday. Ruth looked at the screen. The power button produced the low battery startup sequence, the indicator reading 4%. And beneath it, filling the notification panel in a column too long to read in full, at this charge level, missed calls from Diane. She counted what the screen showed her. 17. Marcus walked to the tree line and stopped there, not leaving, giving her the distance the moment required without withdrawing from it. Ruth walked to the center of the clearing, where the canopy gap was widest, where 2 days of moving around this property had taught her the signal existed when it existed anywhere. She held the phone up and watched the indicator. 1 bar appeared, vanished, appeared again, held. She called Diane. The line rang once, a partial ring, and Diane was there. Not the composed version that appeared at family occasions, but Diane as she actually was, the voice stripped to its real texture, Mom. 1 word carrying everything that word had been carrying for 8 days. Ruth felt something move through her chest. Not pain exactly, not grief exactly, but the specific physical consequence of hearing that you have been searched for by someone who loves you. I'm here. Where? Where are you? I drove to the motel and they said you checked out and you weren't answering. And I called the ranger station and I didn't... A breath controlled with effort. I didn't know what to do. I'm in the woods. I'm okay. She paused, aware of how the first sentence sounded, aware also that it was simply true and no other construction was more accurate. I needed somewhere that didn't already know what I was supposed to be. The line went quiet, not a drop signal, but the quiet of someone receiving a sentence and letting it reach them. Then in a voice that had shifted register lower and less afraid, something in it opening that Ruth had not expected. I know, Mom. Another breath. I should have stayed longer. After Dad, I should have stayed. Ruth looked at the photograph in her pocket, which she could feel through the fabric without touching it. She thought about the cabin behind her, and what it had asked of her, and what it had returned. And she thought about Diane in Denver, not knowing where her mother was for 8 days. And she understood clearly, without sentimentality, that grief narrows the field of vision so completely that you stop being able to see the other people standing in it with you. You couldn't have stayed forever. Her voice holding something that was not quite absolution, but was close to it. And I wouldn't have let you, which is the same problem. A pause. I know. That's what I mean. The battery indicator was flashing. She had seconds. I'll be back tomorrow. I'll explain everything. And then, because it was true, and because Diane deserved true things above all others, I'm all right. I'm actually all right. She ended the call before the phone could die on her, because she wanted that to be the last thing between them. Not a dropped connection, not a battery cut off, but a chosen ending to a necessary sentence. She stood in the clearing for a long time after the screen went dark. That evening, she did the thing she had been too occupied with surviving to do yet, which was make the cabin better than she had found it. Not restored, she didn't have the materials for that, but improved in every way available to her. She split the remaining unsplit wood against the exterior wall and added it to the stack, which now stood chest high and would outlast the first snow if someone kept the fire reasonable. She scrubbed the inside of the metal pot with fine creek sand until the interior was clean enough to cook in without tasting iron. She packed the ridgeboard clay more thoroughly in the last of the afternoon light, filling secondary cracks she had missed in the first pass, waiting the repair with stones until it set. At the table in the amber light of a fire, she had learned to build to exactly the right size for the stove's draft. She took a single sheet from the inside cover of the trail mix packet, the only paper she had, and wrote on the clean side in the smallest clear hand she could manage. She had spent her career writing in small clear hands on charts and intake forms and discharge instructions, and the muscle memory was intact. She read what she had written once. Then she folded it on a clean crease and placed it beneath the ceramic cup in the position where she had found the first note, and set the cup back exactly as Marcus had left it. The note said, "I needed this more than I knew. Thank you for leaving the door open." She stood back and looked at the table. The cup in its position, the note beneath it, the chair pushed in, the fire giving the room its particular low warmth. She had walked into this room a stranger to it and a stranger to herself, if she was honest. And she was leaving it as neither. She slept her last night in the cabin with the photograph on the shelf beside her, face up, visible in the fire's last light. In the morning, she packed the medical kit with the methodical care of someone returning instruments to their proper order after a long procedure. Each item checked, each item replaced. 4 gauze pads, most of the tape roll remaining, the lighter still with fuel, the suture kit, the thread spent, the curved needle still in its sterile housing, the empty packaging folded back around it. She held the packaging for a moment. 3 feet of nylon used for everything it was not designed for, and nothing it was and it had held. She put it back in the kit. It was still a needle. The thread could be replaced. Marcus came at first light, as she had somehow known he would, though nothing had been said. He crossed the clearing in the early gray, not carrying anything this time, and stood outside while she finished closing the pack. When she came out, he fell in beside her, and they walked without ceremony to the southern edge of the clearing, where the trail entered the tree line and began its descent along the ridge's lower contour toward the trailhead, 40 minutes on dry ground. At the trail's entrance, he stopped. She stopped beside him. The morning was cold and clear. The overcast finally broken overnight, and the light was coming over the ridge in long, clean diagonals, finding the water still on the fir needles and making small, brief fires of each one. It was the most beautiful light she had seen in 8 months, which was not a high bar and was still true. Same time next October. His voice unhurried, matter of fact. The way he might note that the woodpile would need restocking in spring. Not an invitation requiring response, just an announcement of availability. If you need it. She looked at him and found that nothing needed to be said, which was the particular gift of people who understood that some acknowledgements were conveyed most accurately through sustained attention and the absence of words. She held his gaze for a moment and nodded once. She started down the trail. She did not look back immediately. The trail descended at an angle that required attention. Loose rock where the rain had moved the soil, and she watched her footing and let the trail and the work of walking occupy her. The trees came close on both sides, and then opened, close, and opened. And through each opening she caught a fraction of the sky, which was moving now, real clouds, dimensional clouds with weight and shadow. Not the flat overcast of the past week, and the cold air carried in her lungs the specific quality of outdoor cold, the kind that confirmed something about being alive that indoor air did not. She was perhaps 15 minutes down the trail when she stopped and turned. The cabin was not visible from this position. The trees had closed entirely between here and the clearing, and there was only the forest and the trail and the ridge rising above, and the place where she had spent 8 days of her life was completely invisible from where she stood. She understood this was the nature of places that held you without advertising themselves. She looked at the trees for a moment, knowing the cabin was there behind what she could see exactly as she had left it. The cup on the table, the note beneath it, the woodpile high against the wall, the door on its well-maintained hinges. Intact, ready. She faced the trail again and kept walking. The trailhead parking lot appeared through the last of the trees, and her car was there, the only vehicle in the lot sitting where she had left it, a week's worth of pine needles and October dust on the windshield. She stopped at the lot's edge for a moment and looked at it with the slight detachment of seeing something familiar after a significant interval, and then crossed. The gravel took out her keys from the jacket pocket where she had kept them every day and put her hand on the door. The metal was cold, not the managed cold of a hospital corridor or a motel room with the climate control set too low, but outdoor cold, the cold of a thing that had been outside for a week and simply was what it was. She felt it in her palm and did not pull away. She stood with her hand on the car door and let the cold be cold and let herself be the person feeling it. And then she opened the door and got in. Her phone was on the passenger seat, charger cable still plugged in. She connected it, pressed the power button, and waited while the startup sequence ran and the screen filled with the accumulated notifications of 8 days. She did not look at them yet. She sat in the driver's seat with the keys in her hand and the phone charging beside her and the windshield covered in a week of forest and the heater not yet running. And she thought, I have been in worse condition than this and known exactly what to do next. She started the car. The engine came on clean, no hesitation, and the heater began moving air that would warm in a minute. She sat with it. Through the dirty windshield, the first stood in the morning light, ordinary and enormous, built at a scale where the duration of a single human life is not the relevant unit of measurement. Not cruel in this, just structural, the way a river is not cruel when it keeps moving after you leave its bank. She thought of Marcus walking back through those trees to the cabin that had been his and then hers, and was now available again for whatever the season required. She thought of the cup on the table with 2 notes beneath it, now layered his invitation and her answer. She thought of Diane picking up the phone on the first ring. She thought of Daniel on a hillside in August holding a length of firewood and grinning. And she found that she could hold the image without the bottom dropping out of her. She could hold it the way you hold something valuable after you have dropped it once and learn that it survives the fall. The heater was warming now. She put the car in reverse, backed out of the lot, and pulled onto the road that led down to the highway. The road curved south, and the trees opened on the passenger side onto a long view down the valley, the river at the bottom in the flat morning light. A town, just rooftops and a water tower from this height, ordinary and specific, and fully irreducibly real. She did not know what Portland would be now, or whether she would return to it, or what shape the coming weeks would take. She did not know if she would stop for breakfast at the first town on the highway, or drive straight through to Denver, or do something else entirely that she hadn't thought of yet. She did not need to resolve any of that from here. What she knew, what she carried out of the Cascades as surely as she carried the medical kit with its spent suture packaging, and the photograph now face up in her pocket, was that she had walked into the trees as someone moving through the motions of a life and was driving out as someone who intended to live one. The road continued south. The light came with her. Behind her in the clearing that no road led to and no map marked a cabin stood with a cup on its table and a door on well-maintained hinges, holding itself ready in the way that necessary things hold themselves ready quietly, without announcement available to whoever arrived, needing it more than they knew. Ruth drove toward the valley and did not look back because she was no longer the kind of person who needed to.